secrets wilted beneath the roses until murder bloomed. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Michael. Let's grow this curious community. Drop a comment and share where you're tuning in from. Hearing from you always makes these mysteries even more special. Now, let's begin. The lilacs had just come into bloom in the village of Little Dithering, and with them came the scent of secrets, though no one would have dared admit as much. On the edge of the village green, behind a tall wrought iron gate and an immaculately trimmed hedge, lay the garden belonging to the late Sir Reginald Forsyth, a retired diplomat with a fondness for hydrangeas, foreign cigars, and, if whispers were to be believed, rather less fondness for the truth. It was a Thursday, bright and promising, when Mrs. Linton's voice broke the stillness of morning with its usual theatrical pitch. She had spotted something unusual from her upstairs landing. The gate to Sir Reginald's garden, normally locked, stood slightly ajar. Curious by nature and constitutionally unable to resist a mystery, however minor, she had flung on her second-best housecoat and marched across the lane to investigate. She did not scream when she found the body. That wasn't Mrs. Linton's way. She gasped, certainly, and pressed a trembling hand to her considerable bosom, but the drama of the moment seemed to sober her. There, face down among the lavender beds, lay Sir Reginald himself, his cravat twisted oddly, his complexion waxy, and his walking stick snapped cleanly in two beside him. By midday, the entire village knew, and by 2 o'clock, Miss Marple had been offered 3 different slices of Battenberg cake and at least 6 differing theories as to how the unfortunate diplomat had come to his end. "He must have slipped," insisted Reverend Clemmings, wiping a tea stain from his sleeve. "That old path's treacherous. Been saying it for years. Moss gets slick in the shade." "Poison," muttered young Peter Lacey, who had read far too many thrillers for someone who still wore short trousers. "Exotic. Something he brought back from Turkey or Egypt or wherever he was. They use darts, you know." "Heart failure," declared Mrs. Banbury, who was prone to diagnosing most ailments from afar, including arthritis, depression, and, in one unforgettable case, shingles. Miss Marple, seated quietly on her floral cushion in the corner of Mrs. Linton's sitting room, sipped her tea and made no comment at all. She had seen the body, having walked over under the pretense of checking on her friend's nerves, and what she noticed, which no one else seemed to find at all curious, was that the garden gloves Sir Reginald always wore when tending to his plants were missing. A small detail. Nothing, perhaps, unless one happens to understand human nature. The official investigation began with little ceremony. Inspector Cray came down from Melchester, all pressed uniform and efficient notepad. He was respectful to the village elders, curt with the nosier ones, and entirely skeptical of amateur speculation. Miss Marple knew his type, hard-working, by the book, and entirely unequipped for the sort of deceptions that flourished in quiet English gardens. "Natural causes until proven otherwise," he said firmly to the assembled villagers, who'd gathered ostensibly to comfort Mrs. Linton but were clearly hoping for a glimpse of the garden through the gate. But by evening, whispers had begun. The local postmistress had seen a stranger at the train station 2 days prior. Tall, dark coat, foreign-sounding voice. The butcher's boy swore he'd overheard Sir Reginald in a heated argument with someone on the telephone just last week. And Mrs. Chilvers, the vicar's aunt, who had lived through 2 wars and once hosted a visiting Norwegian baron, claimed the garden had never felt quite right since Sir Reginald took it over from the previous owners. In the midst of this rising tide of speculation, Miss Marple returned home to her neat little cottage, filled the kettle, and opened her knitting bag. Her fingers moved expertly over the needles, but her mind wandered far from wool and patterns. It was not just the missing gloves that puzzled her. There had been a footprint in the soft earth by the hydrangeas, too large to be Sir Reginald's and too fresh to be accidental. It pointed inward, not outward, as if someone had come in and not left. And the lavender. It had been clipped just stollidier than Sir Reginald ever managed. Someone had tended to the bed after his death. Or, more chillingly, during it. As the kettle whistled and the sun dipped below the rooftops, Miss Marple closed her eyes. She did not need forensic tools or fingerprint dust to know what she sensed already in her bones. Someone in Little Dithering was lying, and the garden, so carefully cultivated and trimmed, was about to reveal more than blossoms. By Friday morning, the news of Sir Reginald Forsyth's death had spread well beyond the tidy hedges of Little Dithering. It fluttered from curtained windows like laundry on the line, carried by whispers and the rustle of newspapers, embroidered with each retelling. The death of a diplomat was notable enough that the fact that it occurred within the sanctified quiet of a village garden transformed it into something near biblical. At Lenton's grocer's, the incident was recounted over flour scoops and weighed butter pats. At the post office, Mrs. Cribbs tapped her pencil on the edge of the scale with uncharacteristic distraction. So absorbed was she in retelling Mrs. Linton's discovery that she stamped the wrong postage on 3 envelopes before being gently corrected by a customer. "It's always the quiet ones," murmured Mr. Symes, the cobbler, shaking his head. Had the look of a man who kept things suppressed. Foreign Service will do that to a fellow. The talk turned naturally to motive, as it always did in Little Dithering when death came, calling. For death here was not some abstract affair as it might be in the cities. It was local, personable, and came with a strong cup of tea and a side of theory. Miss Marple found herself seated, as she often did, at the small round table near the back window of the High Street tea-room, her view partially obscured by a pot of pansies. She wasn't alone. Mrs. Weatherby, whose knowledge of village affairs bordered on the ecclesiastical, leaned forward as she lowered her voice, though not by much. "There was a woman, you know," she said. "There always is," replied Miss Marple gently, stirring her tea. "No, I mean a particular woman, foreign. Used to come by post. Letters. The postmark was never legible, but the handwriting was like one of those typewriters, neat, rigid. Hardly ever smiled, Reginald. But after one of those letters, I once saw him in the greengrocer's, holding an orange and just staring. Like it wasn't a fruit at all, but something accusing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "That's very perceptive of you, Millicent." Mrs. Weatherby nodded, pleased, and returned to her scone. Elsewhere, other conversations bloomed. At the vicarage, Mrs. Chilvers insisted that Sir Reginald had been hiding something in his tool shed. I once saw him sneak back there at dusk with a parcel, wrapped in oilcloth. Very peculiar. In the public house, over a pint and a plate of pickled eggs, a man in a felt cap claimed he'd once delivered a crate to Sir Reginald marked "Private." Not to be opened. From Vienna, he thought. Or was it Zurich? At the hairdresser's, Miss Peggy, who had once cut the diplomat's hair and found his scalp unusually tense, suggested a theory involving spies and forged documents. They say he knew secrets. Diplomatic ones. That sort of man doesn't die in a garden by accident. All of this, of course, was nonsense. Or rather, it was nonsense tangled around something that may have held a grain of truth. Miss Marple had seen it before, the way villagers dig up theories like bulbs in spring. She had no interest in theories. She watched people instead. That afternoon, she took her customary walk around the village, knitting tucked under her arm. The sun was soft, filtered through clouds that promised neither rain nor shade. As she passed the green, she observed Inspector Cray speaking with Constable Ford near the Forsyth house. Their conversation was low and clipped, but Ford's expression revealed much frustration, yes, and confusion, which was even more revealing. Something hadn't added up. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly as she passed them, pretending not to notice. Back at home, she paused in her garden to deadhead a few roses. It helped her think. As she leaned over the dewy stems, a voice called from the lane, "Miss Marple?" May I? It was Emily Hartnell, a school teacher by trade, young but unnervingly observant. She entered through the garden gate, closing it with care, as though afraid it might reveal something if she let it swing. "I suppose you've heard everything?" Emily asked, brushing soil from the seat of her skirt. "Not everything," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "Only what people think they know." Emily hesitated, then pulled a crumpled note from her handbag. This was in the school's lost and found box. "I don't know why I opened it. I never do that, but something about the envelope seemed strange." Miss Marple took the paper gently. The handwriting was narrow and deliberate. The message was brief. "Tell him the garden is no longer safe. I won't be blamed again. No signature. No return address." Miss Marple folded the note without a word, returned it to Emily, and thanked her. Later that evening, she would study the handwriting more carefully. But for now, she only watched the girl's eyes. "You must be careful," she said softly. "Sometimes, in villages such as ours, it's not the secrets themselves that cause harm, but the people desperate to keep them hidden." Emily nodded and left, glancing over her shoulder as she disappeared down the lane. As the sun dipped lower behind the rooftops, the hush of the village was broken only by the occasional dog bark or the echo of a distant bicycle bell. The streets seemed peaceful again, but beneath the surface, the village was roiling. Miss Marple knew what came next: the posturing, the fear, the false confidence, and soon, inevitably, the wrong person would be accused. By Saturday morning, the rhythms of Little Dithering had resumed their outward calm. Milk bottles placed neatly by doors, lace curtains flitting gently in the breeze, and the bell above Lenton's grocer's chiming with practiced predictability. But beneath the polished quiet, the villagers were beginning to draw lines. Not aloud, not overtly, but in small shifts of tone, the flicker of an eye, the deliberate omission of a greeting. The village, in its most civilized way, was bracing for the inevitable arrest. Inspector Cray had set up his informal headquarters in the reading room of the village hall. It was an agreeable choice, stocked with leather-bound ledgers, unlit gas lamps, and a pot of artificial daisies that no one had ever seen, moved, or dusted. Cray had brought with him a typewriter, which clacked incessantly, and a chalkboard upon which names and times were being arranged like pieces on a chessboard. He had begun conducting interviews, not harsh interrogations, but friendly, almost conversational affairs. That, Miss Marple knew, was by design. People were always more likely to reveal things they didn't realize were important when they were made to feel they weren't being questioned at all. Mrs. Linton was the first to be called naturally. Her retelling remained consistent, though she had added a faint embroidery to the narrative since her initial account. She now insisted she had noticed a faint smell of smoke upon entering the garden, though this detail had not been mentioned to anyone else the day prior. Inspector Cray nodded, took notes, and sent her on her way with a courteous thank you and an eyebrow slightly raised. Next came Reverend Clemmings, who had nothing new to add, but expressed firm faith that Sir Reginald's demise was in accordance with God's will, albeit delivered by man's hand, if one is to follow the scriptures. Miss Marple arrived shortly after noon, uninvited but not unwelcome. "Miss Marple," said Cray, gesturing toward the single Windsor chair set before his desk. "Always a pleasure. I'm surprised you haven't come sooner." "I do like to give the official process its space," she replied with a smile, seating herself gracefully. "Besides, there's such a thing as overwatering a flower bed." Cray gave a small chuckle, then folded his arms. "You were there, I understand." "Shortly after, the body was found." "Yes." "Mrs. Linton was rather distressed, so I popped over. We share a fondness for Yorkshire grey roses, and she values moral support when emotions run high." Cray leaned forward slightly. "And what did you see?" Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "I saw a gentleman who had not prepared for death. There were no gloves, you see, and the lavender had been freshly clipped." Cray blinked. "You're certain?" "I've gardened too many years not to notice," she said with gentle confidence. "And there was a footprint, a man's. Deep in the earth and headed inwards, not Reginald's boot, either. He walked with a slight twist in his left leg. War injury. This print was straight." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because, Inspector, there's no use mentioning clues before the village has played its hand. People are so eager to interpret signs to fit their suspicions. It's best to let the stories bubble up first." He paused, pencil hovering. "And which stories have bubbled up to you?" "Oh, several. One involving poison darts, another is about an oilcloth-wrapped parcel in a shed. And one suggestion was that Sir Reginald was a pawn in an international forgery ring." She offered a small, apologetic shrug. "You know how we are." Cray gave her a long look. "Do you believe any of them?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, rising slowly, "that Sir Reginald had more enemies in this village than friends, though none would admit to it. And I believe that someone is going to say something very foolish soon." That afternoon, the foolishness began in earnest. At the luncheon held in the vicarage garden, an event hastily rebranded as a quiet gathering rather than the originally planned celebratory summer tea, the conversation inevitably returned to the dead man. "He was difficult," said Mrs. Banbury, spearing a gherkin. "Terribly formal. Wouldn't even join the flower rota." "And stingy," added Mr. Giles, who had once been refused a small loan by Sir Reginald. "I offered to help him fix the roof last winter. Wouldn't part with a shilling. He said he preferred to hire men with references. As if I hadn't built half the chimneys in this village." "He could be very kind," said Emily Hartnell quietly. "He once donated books to the school anonymously. I only knew because the cover pages were embossed with a seal from his Geneva post." "Books don't mean kindness," muttered Mrs. Weatherby, clearly not trusting anonymous gestures. Miss Marple listened. She sipped, she observed. It was later, while helping carry a tray back into the vicarage kitchen, that she overheard a remark that caught her attention like a burr on wool. "I told him not to stir up what's buried," said a voicemail, low and anxious. "He said it was just garden work, but I knew better." The voice belonged to Arthur Blackstone, the groundskeeper's nephew, a quiet, brooding man of few words and even fewer friends. Miss Marple made no sign of having heard, but her mind tucked it away. That evening, as the village began to settle and curtains were drawn against the encroaching dusk, Inspector Cray returned to the garden. Miss Marple watched him from her sitting-room window. He paused by the flower beds, took notes, and then examined the broken walking stick again. After a moment, he shook his head. She didn't envy him. He was looking for evidence, but the answers, as she knew from long experience, would not be found in crushed petals or garden soil. They were in the words people chose and those they carefully avoided. By Sunday morning, the village of Little Dithering had drawn its collective breath, and Inspector Cray, sensing the pressure to act, was ready to exhale it in the form of a suspect. The rhythm of village life resumed with superficial normalcy. The bells of St. Christopher's rang precisely at 9:30. The church pews filled with starch-collared husbands and gloved wives, and the scent of lilies floated gently on the air. Yet underneath the hymns and pleasantries, a tension simmered. Everyone watched everyone else a little too closely. Murmurs echoed behind hymnals, and more than one pair of eyes flitted toward the empty pew at the back, where Sir Reginald had once sat, stiff and silent, his gloves always in his lap. After the service, a cluster formed around the church steps. The morning sun cast long shadows, and Miss Marple, with her parasol lightly touching the cobblestones, lingered on the periphery, letting chatter drift toward her like dry leaves. "They've brought him in," whispered Mrs. Chilvers, the vicar's aunt, with breathless authority. "Young Blackstone. They say he was seen near the house that morning." "Not just near," added Mrs. Banbury, always eager to contribute. The milkman saw him going in through the side gate, 7:30, far too early for social calls. Miss Marple said nothing but turned slightly, allowing her gaze to wander across the green toward the Forsyth house. A constable stood just inside the garden gate now, as if the flowers might attempt to flee or the lavender confess its secrets. Arthur Blackstone had never been an easy man to read. With dark, deep-set eyes and a habitual stoop, he spoke little and smiled less. He worked odd jobs about the village, gutters, hedges, odd repairs, and never stayed in one place too long. Yet those who paid attention knew he'd been helping Sir Reginald for several months, restoring the stone paths, trimming the ivy, and tending the Diplomat's rather elaborate greenhouse, which housed a surprising number of rare orchids. Miss Marple had noticed the orchids some weeks ago, an odd indulgence for a man who seemed otherwise unconcerned with beauty for beauty's sake. But Sir Reginald, as she had often reflected, was full of contradictions. At the reading room, Inspector Cray now leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who felt the case settling into place. He had motive, Cray announced to Constable Ford, who scribbled diligently at his notepad. Sir Reginald recently dismissed him abruptly, by all accounts. Something about suspicion of theft. "And no alibi?" Ford asked. "Claims he was walking the hedgerows. Not a soul saw him. And then there's the footprint. Right size, right depth." Miss Marple arrived moments later with a small basket of lemon scones. "Gentlemen," she said cheerfully, "I thought you might benefit from some nourishment." Cray smiled politely. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. I do admire how often your baking coincides with developments in my investigations." "Well," she replied, setting down the basket, "one must keep busy in a village such as ours, especially when there's so much to observe." She did not sit, but glanced lightly toward the chalkboard where Arthur Blackstone's name was now circled in bold. "If I may," she said after a moment, "I wonder whether you've considered that Arthur, for all his faults, was rather devoted to those orchids." Cray looked up, curious. "Devotion doesn't prevent resentment." "True," she agreed, "but those plants required constant care. Feeding, humidity adjustments. Quite an effort for someone allegedly planning revenge." Ford frowned. Could be he was using the job as cover, getting inside the property, learning the layout. Miss Marple inclined her head, acknowledging the point. Perhaps. And yet, if one were to plan something dreadful, would they really choose such a visible entry point as the garden gate? At 7:30, when the milkman was about. Cray hesitated. Perhaps he didn't know he was seen, or perhaps someone wanted him to be, Miss Marple said gently. The inspector narrowed his eyes but said nothing further. Outside, the village buzzed with speculation. The grocer's boy swore Arthur had once threatened to settle things with the Diplomat after a row about underpayment. Mrs. Weatherby, citing her keen sense for dark temperaments, insisted she had always felt something was off about him. And Emily Hartnell, torn between doubt and decency, confessed to Miss Marple that she had once seen Arthur and Sir Reginald in heated discussion behind the greenhouse. "I didn't think much of it then," she said quietly. "But now memory is an elastic thing," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Sometimes it stretches to fit a conclusion we're encouraged to reach." That evening, the police made no official arrest, but Arthur Blackstone was not seen about the village. It was said he was being kept at the constable's cottage and questioned further. And yet something didn't sit quite right with Miss Marple. Arthur was a brooding sort, certainly, and there was anger in him. But anger does not always turn to violence. More telling, she thought, was what had not happened. If the man had been dismissed, why had no one seen the argument? Sir Reginald was not one to keep his displeasure quiet. He had once berated a delivery boy so loudly that Miss Marple had heard it through closed windows. No, she thought as she settled into a chair by the fireplace, a knitting needle clicking idly between her fingers. Arthur may have been convenient, but he was not clever. And this time, this garden death among the clipped lavender and broken stick had been clever indeed. Someone was directing suspicion. Someone who knew how people thought, how they gossiped, how they feared what they did not understand. She would need to look deeper, and someone, she suspected, would soon be forced to lie. By Monday morning, the village had settled into the comfortable certainty that Arthur Blackstone was guilty. The relief was almost palpable, like a heat lifting after a storm. Suspicion was exhausting work, after all, and the villagers were not accustomed to living in a state of sustained uncertainty. With Arthur conveniently out of sight and Inspector Cray growing firmer in his tone, many were happy to retreat into their routines, satisfied that the matter was now a question of paperwork, not mystery. But Miss Marple, brushing crumbs from her embroidered breakfast cloth, did not share the sentiment. She had risen early, as was her habit, and had taken a slow walk around the village before the grocers opened and before the first post had been sorted. There was something in the air that morning, an odd stillness, as though something unspoken clung to the hedgerows and gateposts. And so she turned not toward the high street, but toward a more curious destination, the Forsyth house. The constable on watch, a young man named Pierce with a perpetually apologetic manner, knew Miss Marple well enough not to question her appearance. "I won't disturb anything," she said gently, offering a smile. "I've simply been thinking about the garden, about the lavender beds and the greenhouse, and whether they might still have something to say." He hesitated, then opened the gate. "I suppose the inspector wouldn't mind. You're not the sort to trample evidence." She moved past him without another word, her steps light and deliberate. The house loomed ahead, imposing but slightly neglected, like a once sharp suit gone to seed. The windows, shut now, caught the morning light in cold panes. But Miss Marple's interest lay not with the house, but with a small structure tucked behind the main path, the gardener's shelter, where Sir Reginald had kept tools, watering cans, and, according to rumor, more private things. She entered carefully. The scent of peat and metal hung thick in the air. A spade leaned against the wall, a rusted key-ring lay forgotten on the shelf. But what caught her eye was a teacup. It sat on the wooden bench beside a pair of pruning shears out of place, mismatched to the tidy habit of a man like Sir Reginald. Miss Marple drew closer. The cup was cracked, a thin line running down from the rim to the base, and a faint smear of something dark clung to the edge. She touched it lightly with her finger residue, faint but gritty. Not tea, not lipstick, something else entirely. Outside, a gust of wind stirred the ivy, and a shutter clattered somewhere above. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped out of the shed, her mind already spinning. Who had used that cup? Sir Reginald, for all his foreign habits, rarely took tea in the garden unless hosting, and yet no second cup was present. No tray, no spoon. A solitary cup in a shed didn't speak of routine. It spoke of secrecy. Later that day, she visited Emily Hartnell. The school teacher, always gracious, greeted her with cautious warmth. "I wasn't expecting company," she said, guiding Miss Marple inside. "But you're most welcome." The house was neat, if sparse books stacked in corners, a faint scent of lavender soap and the distant ticking of a wall clock. "I'm afraid I must impose on your memory again," Miss Marple said, settling into the armchair Emily offered. "You mentioned you once saw Sir Reginald and Arthur in a disagreement near the greenhouse. I wonder if anyone else is nearby." Emily frowned, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Not that I recall. It was late. I'd been walking back from the school after marking essays. I saw them through the fence. But now that you mention it," she hesitated. "Yes," Miss Marple encouraged. "There was someone else. Not in the garden exactly, but walking along the path behind it, near the rear gate that leads to the old orchard lane. Could you tell who it was? Emily shook her head. A man, I think. Dark coat. He moved quickly, like he didn't want to be seen. Interesting, said Miss Marple, reaching for her bag. She paused for a moment, then added, And did you ever drink tea at Sir Reginald's? Emily blinked. Number, he wasn't fond of guests. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. Nor mismatched teacups, I would imagine. That afternoon, Miss Marple made a short stop at the post office, speaking briefly with Mrs. Cribbs about the previous week's deliveries. The postmistress, despite her glasses, confirmed that a package had arrived on Wednesday addressed to Sir Reginald in heavy brown paper with no return address. Left by a man with an accent she couldn't quite place. He didn't say much. She recalled. Just asked if Reginald was expecting correspondence. Odd that. When asked whether she remembered what time it was posted, Mrs. Cribbs nodded. Just after midday. The same day the Vicar's magazines came in. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each fact, stacking them like thread spools color-coded and patiently waiting. She returned home just as the church bells tolled 4. Rain threatened in the distance, grey clouds rolling low and heavy over the hills. She lit the fire, sat in her chair, and reached for her notebook, the cracked teacup, the footprint, the missing gloves, the discarded package, and now the figure by the orchard gate. None of these things would catch the attention of a hurried inspector, but to Miss Marple they were threads, and she had spent a lifetime untangling knots. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, and across the village, somewhere behind drawn curtains and a false sense of calm, the murderer, still unknown, began to sense that the quiet old woman with the knitting basket was paying attention. The rain fell steadily through Tuesday morning, silencing the usual rhythms of the village with a soft and persistent patter. Little Dithering was wrapped in the damp hush of weather that encouraged reflection, and in its warm kitchens and fogged-up drawing rooms, reflection often gave way to confession, though rarely to the right person. Miss Marple, seated by the window of her parlour, knitting needles clicking softly in time with the rain, watched the empty lane outside with the quiet patience of a woman who knew that truth often walked slower than lies. She had seen movement that morning, a figure hurrying from the vicarage toward the reading room, coat drawn tight, collar up. Not someone used to being out in bad weather. Not someone used to being seen without purpose. She rose at 10:30, tied her scarf with practiced care, and set off toward the vicarage. The wind tugged at the hem of her coat and scattered fallen rose petals across the path, but her steps were firm. The Reverend Clemmings opened the door with a slightly flustered look, clearly mid-sermon writing or perhaps mid-excuse-making. Miss Marple. A surprise. Do come in. In weather like this, you'll catch your death. Don't worry, Reverend, she said gently, brushing rain from her sleeves. At my age, one doesn't catch death. It merely waits politely at the door. He chuckled uneasily and guided her into the parlour, where Mrs. Clemmings sat embroidering a half-finished cushion of dubious design. Tea was promptly offered, accepted, and poured. I do hope I'm not intruding, said Miss Marple as she stirred her cup. But I was passing by and remembered the vicar once mentioned Sir Reginald had expressed interest in church records. Old burial deeds, I believe? The vicar blinked, surprised. Why, yes. Now you mention it. Several weeks ago, he asked about a plot and wanted to know if a certain section of the churchyard had ever been exhumed or reassigned. Curious subject for conversation, Miss Marple said mildly. He said it was for a friend, from abroad. Wanted to be sure his ancestors weren't disturbed by future development. I thought it odd at the time, but Reginald was private. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. Exhumed graves, secrecy, and Sir Reginald's peculiar interest in an old garden and a locked tool shed. On her way home, she paused under the awning of the bakery to avoid the worst of the rain. Across the lane, Emily Hartnell was speaking quietly with Mrs. Linton, the widow who had first discovered the body. Miss Marple watched them carefully. Emily's posture was tense, shoulders tight, hands clutched around her bag. Mrs. Linton, for once, wasn't doing the talking. Later that afternoon, Emily arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, cheeks flushed and breathing shallow from the walk. "I didn't know who else to speak to," she said at once, removing her damp gloves. "You did well to come," Miss Marple replied kindly, guiding her inside and settling her near the fire. "People often need a neutral air, especially when guilt and grief look so alike." Emily looked up sharply. "I'm not guilty. I didn't say you were. But something is weighing on you." Emily hesitated, then spoke quickly, as though afraid the words might rot if left unspoken. "There was a woman, a visitor. Foreign French, I think. She came to the school last month asking about Sir Reginald. She said she was researching a biography and needed to know whether he had ever contributed to village charities. I thought it odd. She never gave a name, only said she'd be back, but she never returned." Miss Marple sat back, eyes narrowing slightly. "And did you tell Sir Reginald?" "I mentioned it in a passing. He brushed it off and said she was probably a journalist. But the way his expression changed, I knew he was frightened." "And this woman, did anyone else see her?" Emily nodded. "Mrs. Linton, I think. She saw her near the green and said she had the look of a widow with an opinion." Miss Marple almost smiled. Mrs. Linton's assessments, for all their colour, were rarely wrong. "Emily," she said gently, "I must ask you something, and I hope you'll answer truthfully. When you saw Sir Reginald and Arthur Blackstone arguing, do you remember what was said?" Emily looked uncertain. "Not all of it. But I remember Reginald said, 'You'll ruin everything if you go digging again.' And Arthur said, 'It's already ruined. I know what I found.'" That evening, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Linton. The widow welcomed her with a tart expression and an even tarter apple crumble. "I don't know what the inspector's waiting for," she said, pouring tea. "That Arthur boy is clearly hiding something." "He may well be," Miss Marple agreed. "But so are others. Do you recall a woman, perhaps French, asking about Sir Reginald a few weeks ago?" Mrs. Linton blinked. "Of course. She had one of those little notebooks with elastic around it. Wore far too much perfume. She told me she was researching diplomats, but she asked very little about his career and quite a lot about his garden." "Did she return?" "Number. But I remember she seemed disappointed by the state of the flower beds. She said something like, 'It's nothing like the one in Brussels.'" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Brussels? That's what she said. I thought she meant vegetables at first. You know I grow them myself. But no, she meant a place. The embassy, perhaps." That night, Miss Marple returned home and added a new line to her growing notebook. "Brussels, embassy garden, woman French. Arthur found something." The pieces were no longer scattered, but were forming a shape. There had been another life before Little Dithering. One Sir Reginald had tried to bury with clipped hedges and carefully brewed silences. But human secrets had deep roots, and someone had decided to uproot them, even if it meant murder. The rain gave way to a cold, dry wind on Wednesday morning, and with it came the return of footsteps on the cobblestones, firm, deliberate, and unfamiliar. In Little Dithering, a stranger was never just a stranger. He was a disruption to the rhythm, an uninvited thread in the carefully woven tapestry of village life. The man appeared first at the post office, asking for directions to the Forsyth house. Tall, with grey temples and a foreign-made briefcase, he bore the faint smell of foreign cologne and something metallic, something bureaucratic. Mrs. Cribbs took one look at him and mentally catalogued him as government or worse. He next appeared at the village hall where Inspector Cray was reviewing witness statements. Their conversation was short, hushed, and marked by several glances toward the window. When the man departed, Cray's expression had changed, no longer confident, but tight-lipped and wary. Miss Marple noticed it all from the bench across the green, where she sat knitting a rather homely tea cosy. She watched the stranger leave the hall, then pause at the crossroads with the look of someone memorizing the shape of a place he hoped never to return to. It wasn't grief on his face, it was calculation. That afternoon, Emily Hartnell returned to Miss Marple's cottage, her cheeks pale despite the wind. "He's Belgian," she said without preamble, referring to the man who visited this morning. "I saw him leaving the vicarage." "Belgian?" Miss Marple repeated gently, setting aside her needles. "His name's Monsieur Delacour. He asked the vicar about Sir Reginald's time in Brussels. He said he was handling the remains of a regrettable misunderstanding. That's how he put it." Miss Marple frowned. "Did he say anything about the garden?" "Yes," Emily said, lowering her voice. "He asked whether the greenhouse had ever been altered, and whether any renovations were made recently. He wanted to see it himself." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the window, gazing out at the pale sky, now cloudless and cold. That same evening, a commotion stirred in the village. A second body had been found. It was Constable Ford who discovered it, though he would later say he wasn't truly looking. He had wandered past the Forsyth property on his way home, cutting across the back hedge where the garden met the disused orchard lane. The scent of damp earth and decay drew him to a patch of ivy that had grown thick over a sunken wall. There, partially obscured by stone and root, was a shape. The body was not fresh. Inspector Cray's return to the scene was brisk and wordless. He dismissed the onlookers with harsh efficiency and called for lanterns and a barrier of sacks to shield the sight. News spread anyway. Miss Marple was not among the gawkers. She waited until dusk before making her way quietly to the reading room, where Cray stood at the chalkboard again, this time with an erased name and a new set of questions. "You've heard?" he asked without turning. "I've heard," Miss Marple said gently, "but I haven't heard who it is." Cray exhaled. "That's the curious part. No identification. Man, perhaps in his 40s. Clothes suggest foreign manufacture. No wallet. Hands rough gardener's hands or laborers. But the manner of death he trailed off." "Unusual." Cray nodded. "There's no sign of trauma. But the body had been hidden well, buried, then left to rot under the ivy, long enough to suggest planning. Not a recent murder. Maybe weeks. And how does Sir Reginald fit into this?" "That's what I can't see," Cray admitted, "unless this is what Blackstone meant when he said he found something." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "You believe Arthur found this body and tried to confront Sir Reginald?" "Possibly, but there's more." He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "We found this in the greenhouse, stuffed behind a broken vent panel, dated 2 years ago." He handed it to her. The letter was written in a tight, slanted hand. "Ah, if she comes, deny everything. The garden must remain untouched. I've kept my part. You must keep yours. This isn't just about us anymore. It was unsigned." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it with care. "Do you intend to release Arthur Blackstone?" Cray's face hardened. "I may not have a choice." The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Linton, who seemed unusually reserved. Her normally theatrical manner was muted, and she poured tea with an unsteady hand. "You've heard about the body, I assume?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Linton nodded. "Horrid business, just when we thought things were calming down. You knew Sir Reginald well, didn't you?" "Well enough. He wasn't what you'd call sociable, but he had his charm." "Did he ever speak of Brussels?" Mrs. Linton stiffened. "Once or twice, always in vague terms. He said he'd seen things there. Diplomatic mistakes, he called them." Did he ever speak of a woman named Celeste? The teacup rattled as Mrs. Linton set it down. Where did you hear that name? It was in the letter, and mentioned by the French visitor some weeks ago. Mrs. Linton hesitated, then sighed. She came here once. Late. I think she'd been drinking. She wanted to confront him, but he wouldn't open the door. She was crying. Said something about what they did in the garden in 39. I never saw her again. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It's beginning to take shape. That night, as the wind returned to rustle the leaves outside, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, notebook open on her lap. A second death. A body hidden beneath ivy. A cryptic letter. A woman who disappeared. The answers lay not in the facts alone, but in the patterns of guilt, of evasion, and of silence cultivated like weeds behind the walls of the Diplomat's garden. The past, once buried, had clawed its way back to the surface, and Miss Marple, with her knitting untouched and eyes fixed on the firelight, knew the real game had only just begun. Thursday dawned with a brittle chill in the air, as though the village itself was holding its breath. The usual rhythms of little dithering clanging milk pails, bicycles rattling over cobblestones, and the smell of fresh bread from Lenton's bakery felt muted beneath the weight of recent revelations. The second body had changed everything. No one said so aloud, of course. The villagers simply walked more briskly, spoke more softly, and avoided lingering near the garden gate that now seemed permanently watched by the past. Miss Marple, however, was not one for silence in the face of unease. She knew that the most dangerous lies were not spoken aloud, but allowed to settle, quietly, into the gaps left by assumption. And so she had decided to sew her way toward the truth, not with needles and thread, but with careful questions and a few choice conversations. The first stitch came at the tea shop, where she found Mrs. Weatherby sipping weak Earl Grey with the faintly scandalized air of someone still recovering from a week of village gossip. "I do wonder," said Mrs. Weatherby with a sniff, "if the foreign gentleman had something to do with it. You know the type, always turning up after the fact, poking about where decent folk wouldn't dare." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. It's often the people who seem most out of place that carry the weight of buried stories. Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "You mean he knew about the body?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "Or perhaps he feared what someone else might uncover." She let that thought hang for a moment, then casually added, "Did you ever meet anyone else during Sir Reginald's time here?" "From abroad, I mean." Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice. "There was a woman once. Strange accent. I think she was French. She came to the harvest market last year and asked all sorts of odd questions about Reginald's property. I thought she was a travel writer, or one of those people who do radio plays. Did she mention Brussels?" Mrs. Weatherby paused. "Yes, actually. Said the garden reminded her of a place that should have been sacred." Miss Marple tucked that phrase away, letting it join the others that had begun to form a pattern distinct and inevitable, like embroidery. Later that day, she made her way to the greenhouse. The gate creaked as she entered, and the garden, despite the cold, still held a faint perfume of damp earth and lavender. Arthur Blackstone stood at the edge of the flower bed, coat collar up, a spade half buried in the soil beside him. He looked up as she approached, eyes wary. "They said I could come back," he muttered. Nothing was proved. "No," said Miss Marple, "but not disproved either. Which is worse in a place like this." Arthur's mouth tightened. "You think I did it?" "I think," she said carefully, "that you discovered something worth killing for, and I don't believe you have the temperament for murder." He snorted. "You know me that well." "I know what guilt looks like," Miss Marple replied. "And I know what it means to carry grief disguised as anger. Tell me, what did you find, Arthur? Before all this?" He hesitated, then looked down at the flower bed. There was something under the compost bin, an old wooden box, half rotted. Inside papers, letters, photographs, burned at the edges, but I could still read some. Names, places, embassy staff, and one name kept showing up. Celeste. Miss Marple nodded, the pieces sliding more firmly into place. "What did you do with them?" "I gave them to Reginald," Arthur said bitterly. "He thought he should know someone had buried secrets in his garden, but he already knew. Said it was nothing. Said to leave it alone. Then a week later, he told me not to come back. And you didn't think to tell anyone." Arthur looked away. Why would they believe me? She left him to the silence of the greenhouse and walked home slowly, her thoughts as sharp and exacting as her knitting needles. That evening, she invited Emily Hartnell for tea. "I have a question for you," she said after they'd settled. "And I ask it not as an accusation, but as someone who believes you may have known more than you realized." Emily's eyes widened. "Go on. Did Sir Reginald ever speak of Celeste to you?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Only once. He said she had loved beauty too much. Those gardens were her sanctuary. I thought he meant it metaphorically." Miss Marple reached for a small envelope on the table and slid it toward her. This letter was found in the greenhouse. "The handwriting, do you recognize?" Emily picked it up, studied it, and then set it down slowly. "It's hers. I saw one like it in his study once. He hid it when he realized I'd seen." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "I believe she came here to confront him, and I believe she never left." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. "You think he killed her?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone did, and then tried to hide it beneath soil and silence." The next day, Miss Marple attended the funeral service held quietly for Sir Reginald. It was a brief affair, with few mourners. Most villagers came only to be seen, not out of affection. A few whispered condolences. Fewer still lingered. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Miss Marple stood very still at the edge of the churchyard. She watched the faces. Crazy, Arthur, Emily, and one more. Mrs. Linton. Her hands were gloved, her eyes dry, but there was a flicker of something restrained, something too composed. Miss Marple noted it and said nothing. She would wait. Because the final stitch in a tapestry was never the one that drew the most attention. It was the one that held the rest together. The village of Little Dithering seemed to breathe a collective sigh after the burial of Sir Reginald Forsyth. The routine resumed once more. Windows were polished, soup simmered in orderly kitchens, and milkmen resumed their quiet chatter with housewives at the gate. But the calm was brittle and too rehearsed, like a performance staged for the benefit of anxious minds needing something familiar to hold on to. And yet, under the surface, something continued to shift. Miss Marple spent that Friday morning in her parlor, watching the late autumn light stretch long across the windowsill. She had finished her tea and rearranged her flowers, Jacques violets this weekend, and had begun, at last, to wind the final threads of the case into their proper pattern. There was still one piece left to move, one test to be performed. It was time to stir the soil just enough. She sent out 3 invitations, not formal, just polite notes handwritten on thick cream paper, delivered by hand. One to Inspector Cray, one to Emily Hartnell, and one, most carefully, to Mrs. Linton. A tea at her cottage that afternoon. To reflect on the past week's terrible confusion, she wrote, and perhaps to share a few observations. They arrived promptly. Emily first, looking weary but lighter somehow, as though carrying one fewer burden than the day before. Cray followed, his expression unreadable as ever. And lastly, Mrs. Linton, bundled in a fine camel coat, her face framed by the same determined poise that she had worn since the day of the first discovery. The fire was warm, The tea was perfectly steeped, and the biscuits, nice lavender shortbread, were soft at the center, just the way Miss Marple liked them. They exchanged pleasantries for a while, the way one always does in England, no matter the weight of suspicion in the air. And then, once the cups had been refilled and the tension had begun to settle into the room like steam on glass, Miss Marple quietly cleared her throat. "I wonder," she said gently, "if we might speak plainly for a moment. Not as suspects or investigators, but as people who have seen something quite ugly grow out of a very beautiful place." Inspector Cray shifted in his chair, watching her closely. Mrs. Linton offered a tight smile. Emily clasped her teacup a little more firmly. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued, "about gardens. They are peculiar things, meant to calm, to please, to charm, but also to conceal. They're ideal places for hiding both treasures and sins, especially a garden like Sir Reginald's." Cray leaned forward. "You have a theory, Miss Marple?" "I have more than that, Inspector. I have the shape of a truth." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle. The man buried beneath the ivy was no accident. He wasn't just murdered. He was removed, silenced, and someone ensured that body remained hidden until time and the elements could disguise the truth. "But who?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple turned her eyes, slowly toward Mrs. Linton. The older woman did not speak, but something flickered, barely visible, behind her polished facade. "You saw the Frenchwoman, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Celeste. She came to the village last year, and you recognized her, not from her questions, but from the past." Mrs. Linton's smile wavered. "I don't know what you mean." "I believe you do," Miss Marple said kindly, "because she wasn't just a stranger. She had been part of something that Sir Reginald deeply regretted, something buried in Brussels, behind diplomatic immunity and euphemisms. She was the witness he couldn't silence through political channels. And when she came looking, she threatened not just his reputation, but yours." Mrs. Linton's teacup sat untouched. "I've lived in Little Dithering long enough," Miss Marple went on, "to know when someone is running from something. You arrived 5 years ago, alone, well-heeled, well-read, and remarkably discreet about your past. You were drawn to Sir Reginald, but not romantically. No, I believe your pasts intersected abroad, perhaps during the war, perhaps in post-war embassies. But there was something the two of you shared, something that involved her." She turned briefly to Cray. She came to confront him. They argued. Perhaps it became physical, and in a moment of panic or premeditated opportunity, she was killed. "And hidden," Cray said slowly, "with the help of someone who knew the property well." Emily looked from one face to the next. But why? What could she possibly have known that was worth killing for? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "I suspect Celeste carried not only knowledge, but also proof. Papers, letters, photographs, the same ones Arthur found buried behind the greenhouse. Things Sir Reginald thought long destroyed. Things that implicated both him and, perhaps, a third party. One who feared her secrets more than he did." Cray stood. "Are you accusing Mrs. Linton?" "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple, never raising her voice, "that Mrs. Linton knew more than she said, and that she helped cover up the death not out of malice, but out of shared guilt, or loyalty, perhaps even fear." Mrs. Linton said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, she picked up her teacup and placed it gently on the saucer. "She came here that night," she said, her voice flat. "Crying, furious. She'd lost everything because of them, because of the cover-up, the embassy scandal. I tried to calm her, but she was wild with anger. She said she would expose it all, that she didn't care if it ruined every man involved." "And Sir Reginald?" asked Cray. He arrived unexpectedly. They shouted. He pushed her. She slipped, hit her head against the stone wall, and you helped him hide it? Mrs. Linton looked at the fire. He was afraid. And so was I. We told ourselves we were protecting something bigger, diplomatic stability and reputations. Lies, of course, but they felt like truths at the time. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, and the man buried under the ivy. Mrs. Linton flinched. Celeste's brother, he came looking for her, too persistent, too close. Reginald panicked. I didn't stop him. Emily stared, frozen. Cray stepped forward, expression unreadable. You understand this is a confession, Mrs. Linton? The older woman nodded once. I've carried it long enough. Better to be remembered for the truth than live forever behind curtains and tea trays. And as the silence reclaimed the room, Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Outside, the wind stirred the lavender again. In the garden of lies, the truth had finally bloomed. The following days in Little Dithering unfolded with an eerie stillness, as though the village itself were drawing breath after a long, stifling silence. The revelation of Mrs. Linton's involvement had spread like a soft ripple through the lanes and parlours, not with the crashing force of scandal, but with the quiet inevitability of something long suspected but never voiced. People spoke in murmurs now, if they spoke at all. They nodded a little more solemnly in the grocer's, lingered longer at the post office window, and glanced more often at the garden behind the wrought iron gate that had, for so long, kept the truth tucked behind ornamental ivy and lavender hedges. Mrs. Linton did not resist when Inspector Cray came for her. There were no tears, no protestations, only a carefully packed valise, her lips drawn in the familiar line of grace she'd worn since her arrival in the village 5 years earlier. She offered Miss Marple a quiet nod as she passed, something between farewell and gratitude. It was not forgiveness she sought, only relief from the weight of the thing she had buried. The village, as ever, resumed its rhythm with remarkable resilience. By Monday, the Lenton shop had restored its window display to seasonal jams and chutneys. The vicar resumed his sermons with renewed seriousness, preaching on the dangers of buried pride. And Emily Hartnell returned to her classroom with a gentler smile and a new sense of calm in her voice, her eyes less clouded by unanswered questions. But for Miss Marple, resolution never arrived all at once. It came slowly, gently, like the finishing of a final stitch or the delicate placement of the last petal on a cake. She had no satisfaction in guilt, only in clarity. And now, with the last piece in place, she allowed herself the pleasure of sitting by her window with her knitting in hand, watching the village breathe again. Inspector Cray came to see her 2 days later. He arrived without fanfare, hat in hand, and accepted her offer of tea with the faint smile of a man who had been corrected firmly, yet kindly. I must admit, he said, settling into the floral armchair, I didn't see her coming. Linton, I mean. She never struck me as the type. She was the type, Miss Marple replied softly. The type who carries the guilt of others until it becomes her own. There is no singular type for guilt, Inspector. That's where so many investigators go wrong. They look for rage, for temper. But true guilt often wears pearls and knits quietly by the fire. Cray studied her for a moment. How did you know it was her? I didn't. Not at first. I suspected Reginald, of course, but even he seemed too self-preserving to act without help. And when the second body was found, I realized it had to be someone capable of calm cruelty. Someone who had stayed in the village to watch the consequences unfold, not out of necessity, but out of a need to remain in control of the story. He nodded. And the woman Celeste? Miss Marple sipped her tea. She never stood a chance. Her grief was loud, emotional, and disorganized, and it collided with the sort of tidy secrets this village and Reginald preferred to keep locked away. I've seen it before. The person who shouts the truth is always dismissed first. It's the one who whispers that you must watch. Cray looked down at his cup. You've got a gift, Miss Marple, not just for deduction, but for understanding people. Observation, Inspector. That's all it is. Observation and memory. Two things people undervalue until it's far too late. He smiled, stood, and replaced his hat. Thank you for everything. After he left, Miss Marple returned to her window. Outside, the trees had begun to change, the first hints of gold brushing their edges. The garden at the Forsyth house had been left untended since the investigation closed. The lavender drooped slightly, the hedges unruly. But beneath the overgrowth, new shoots of rose and sage had begun to emerge. Emily Hartnell came by a few days later, bearing a bouquet of late summer marigolds and a jar of honey from her father's apiary. "You were right," she said as they shared tea. "About everything." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not everything. Just enough." Emily hesitated. "Will it always feel strange, knowing the truth?" "For a time," Miss Marple replied. "Then the truth becomes part of the furniture. You'll find that most people prefer lies because they're easier to dust around." They both laughed softly and carefully, and the warmth of it lingered long after the tea was gone. The garden gate was finally unlocked the following week. A quiet solicitor from Melchester came to catalogue the estate, and a notice appeared in the village board about the potential sale of the property. There was some mild interest. Mr. Symes muttered about converting the greenhouse into a sunroom, but no one moved quickly. The soil still felt too unsettled. One evening, Miss Marple returned to the garden. She let herself in with a gentle click of the gate and walked slowly along the paths she now knew too well. The hydrangeas were beginning to fade, the last of their color giving way to the earth's return. She paused at the old bench beside the greenhouse, where once a teacup had sat with its cracked lip and bitter residue. Now there was nothing, just wind and dust and the echo of things no longer hidden. She knelt, pressed her hand lightly to the soil, and whispered a name she never had the chance to say aloud. Celeste. Then she rose and walked home. Behind her, the garden remained quiet, but no longer silent. It had told its story, and Miss Marple, as always, had listened. For fans of Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, Nero Wolfe, and English mysteries, this was another tale of subtle deduction, of secrets grown like weeds, and of justice blooming in the most unexpected soil. The garden behind the Forsyth house had grown quieter still, though its silence no longer hinted at secrets, only the gentle hush of something released. Nature, indifferent to human tragedy, had begun the slow reclaiming of what once was hidden beneath its roots and blooms. Ivy reached once more for the low wall, bees moved lazily between the last of the sage blossoms, and the earth, freshly turned and inspected, was finally left to settle. In the days following Mrs. Linton's quiet departure, the village shifted again. There was no explosion of scandal or uproar of gossip. Instead, little Dithering responded in the only way it knew, by absorbing the truth like rainfall into dry soil. A few whispered conversations occurred over post boxes and in the back pews, but they softened quickly into the background noise of daily life. There was always jam to stir, boots to mend, and letters to sort. Miss Marple, however, felt something unfinished. Not in the legal sense. Inspector Cray had confirmed that Mrs. Linton's cooperation, combined with the physical evidence and her confession, would lead to a formal but largely private resolution. The Foreign Office had, somewhat predictably, swept in with quiet, officious efficiency. They were eager to close the book on Sir Reginald's past and offered little resistance to the notion of retiring the matter entirely from public record. But to Miss Marple, the conclusion of a case was not measured in arrests or signed statements. It was measured in the restoration of equilibrium in the way people carried themselves, spoke each other's names, and walked the lanes of the village with or without hesitation. And she had noticed one figure who still walked as though pursued. Arthur Blackstone. He had resumed working in the garden, not the Forsyth garden, of course, but the small plots behind the chapel and at the edge of the old rectory grounds. He worked harder than before, staying late into the dusk, shoulders hunched as though fighting against some invisible wind. His presence no longer attracted suspicion, but it still carried discomfort. The villagers, though no longer accusing, remained uncertain of him. That uncertainty, Miss Marple thought, could fester into a different kind of injustice if left unchecked. So, one afternoon, she walked to the chapel grounds with a basket of currant scones and a flask of hot tea. Arthur looked up as she approached, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his jumper. He gave her a cautious nod. "I didn't steal anything," he said simply. "I know that," Miss Marple replied, setting the basket down on the stone ledge beside him. "And you didn't kill anyone either." He said nothing, only stared at the hedge he'd been trimming. "But you did keep a secret longer than you should have," she added, her tone light but firm. "And I expect that's eating at you more than you let on." He glanced at her, expression unreadable. "I didn't know what to do. I found the box buried behind the greenhouse. I opened it. I saw the letters, photographs, stuff I didn't understand, names I didn't recognize. I brought it to him because I don't know. I thought maybe he'd thank me, or explain." Miss Marple watched the wind rustle the chapel hedge. "But he was furious," Arthur continued. "Told me never to speak of it. Said it was diplomatic property. National interest, he called it. And did you believe him?" "I wanted to. But no, he looked afraid. That's what I remember. Not angry. Afraid." Miss Marple poured them each a cup of tea. "Do you know why Mrs. Linton stayed?" Arthur shook his head. "She stayed because the past was quieter here. Because no one asked too many questions, and because Sir Reginald had convinced her they'd done something noble once, something necessary. People will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve a version of their past that makes them feel decent." Arthur frowned. "I should have done more." "You did enough," Miss Marple said gently. "And you did not kill Celeste, nor her brother. And sometimes that's what matters most, not what we saw or even what we failed to stop, but what we refused to become." They drank their tea quietly. Across the lane, a pair of schoolboys rode past on bicycles, their laughter bouncing off the hedgerows. That evening, Miss Marple sat again by her window with her knitting in hand. The sky outside had turned a pale gold, the kind of light that reminded her of old photographs and dusty hymnals. She was not tired, but thoughtful. This scandal of secrets buried under petals and soil had not been the grandest she'd ever witnessed. No train timetables or masked assassins. No poisoned cigars or vanished wills. And yet, it had been one of the most human. She reached for the final sheet of her notebook and wrote a single line. The garden remembered what they hoped time would forget. There was a knock at her door. It was Emily. She stood holding a small wooden box, the kind used for storing seed packets. "I found this behind a drawer in the school cupboard," she said. It belonged to Celeste. Her name's carved inside the lid. I thought you might know what to do with it. Miss Marple took the box carefully. "I do." Inside were pressed flowers, labeled in French and English. Gardenia, Narcisse, Myosotis. Each with a note. One in particular read, "For remembrance. Not to forget, but to forgive." Miss Marple closed the lid gently. Later, she would write to the Belgian consulate and see to it that the box and its memory reached those who had waited too long for answers. But for now, she simply lit a candle, set the box beside it, and let the shadows fall across the lavender that bloomed, stubborn and soft, outside her window. In Little Dithering, life continued, and Miss Marple, with eyes that saw too much and a voice that whispered truth beneath its gentleness, remained its quiet observer. The garden was quiet now, but it had spoken, and she had listened. The first frost of the season dusted the hedgerows of Little Dithering in a soft shimmer by the second week of November. It crept across rooftops, coated stone walls, and left behind a fragile film on garden spades and watering cans. Even the path to the Forsyth house, long untouched since the final visit by the authorities, sparkled faintly in the dawn light. The garden there had gone dormant, its once vivid colors dulled to brittle stalks and dry blooms, but there was still a quiet kind of beauty in it, the sort of beauty that accepts endings. Inside her warm cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple stood before her writing desk, wrapping a short note with twine. The carved wooden box Emily had found, Celeste's box, now rested inside a parcel addressed to the Belgian consulate. The pressed flowers remained just as she had found them, but Miss Marple had added a folded note of her own, explaining how they had been discovered and that perhaps, with time, they might find their way into the hands of someone who would remember the woman who had once tended to embassies, not espionage. When she stepped out to send the parcel, the air bit at her cheeks and the morning smelled of wood smoke and distant baking. The village stirred quietly as it always had, but something had shifted in its collective posture. The scandal had not destroyed Little Dithering. Miss Marple had not expected it to, but it had reshaped the way the villagers glanced at one another. There was more care in their conversations now, more hesitation before judgment, and an understanding that the surface of a person, no matter how perfectly polished, rarely told the full tale. At the post office, Mrs. Cribbs accepted the parcel with her usual crisp efficiency, but her eyes lingered on the name on the label. "Foreign address?" she asked. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but a very old matter." Mrs. Cribbs nodded as though she knew precisely what that meant, though Miss Marple suspected she did not. On her walk home, she passed the green and paused by the bench under the yew tree where Sir Reginald had once sat, alone, puffing on his imported cigars and pretending not to watch the villagers. She paused for a long moment, her hands clasped before her, and let the memory of him drift through her thoughts, not as he was in death, but as he had been when he first arrived. Polite, guarded, quietly observant. He had carried the weight of his past like a well-fitted overcoat, never flaunted, never entirely removed. In the end, his downfall had not come from foreign spies or old political rivals, but from the very thing he believed he had mastered, his garden, a place designed for control, order, and peace. But nature had no interest in hiding the past. The earth forgets nothing, Miss Marple thought, and it always finds a way to bring things to the surface. Back at her cottage, she resumed knitting something soft in pale green and allowed her thoughts to settle into a quieter rhythm. There would be no more visitors for now. Inspector Cray had returned to Melchester, content to let the village mend itself. Mrs. Linton remained in custody, though word had reached Miss Marple through the vicar that she was cooperative and resigned, even asking for gardening magazines to read in her cell. Emily Hartnell had resumed her weekly reading club at the schoolhouse, and Arthur Blackstone had been hired by Mrs. Chilvers to rebuild her back wall, which had collapsed conveniently during the last storm. Life, as always, was resilient in Little Dithering. But beneath the repaired walls and polite smiles, there was a new awareness, a deeper sense of what people were capable of when cornered by memory, guilt, or love. On Sunday, the village gathered for the remembrance service. The church was packed tighter than usual, and the hymns, though familiar, carried a weight they rarely did. Miss Marple sang softly beside Emily, who held a bundle of dried lavender wrapped in ribbon, a quiet tribute for the forgotten. After the final prayer, the congregation filed out, nodding to one another with a gentleness uncharacteristic for late autumn. Outside the chapel, a few villagers paused to talk. There was no mention of Reginald Forsyth or the scandal in the Diplomat's garden, but there were knowing looks, shared silences, and the kind of heavy pauses that say more than gossip ever could. Later, Emily joined Miss Marple for tea. bringing with her a collection of old-school newsletters she'd uncovered during a cupboard reorganization. Miss Marple, amused, helped her sort them by year, and the two women spent a peaceful hour sipping tea and laughing over misprinted event dates and outdated recipes for sweat pudding. As twilight approached, Emily asked, "Do you ever get tired of it, Miss Marple? The puzzles? The secrets?" Miss Marple paused, folding a newsletter in half with care. "Not tired, exactly. But sometimes I do wish people were less afraid of telling the truth before it grows thorns." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think we'll forget what happened?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "the village will tuck it away like everything else neatly and politely, with just enough room left for denial. But some of us will remember, and that's enough." That night, a light frost dusted the windows once more, and Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, returned to her writing desk. She opened her ledger and added the final line beneath the story's name. "Justice, like a garden, must be tended patiently, and the roots of truth, however deep, always find their way to light." She closed the book, set aside her pen, and turned toward the fire, where the flames flickered softly, warming the quiet house. Outside, the village of Little Dithering slept, and Miss Marple, watcher of gardens and souls alike, allowed herself just for tonight to rest